After the Second World War ended, the United States made a secret deal with the men who ran the most brutal experiments in human history. In exchange for their data, not a single one was ever put on trial. Their victims, thousands of men, women, and children, were simply erased from history. For over 50 years, the world agreed to look the other way. This is the story of what they chose to forget. To understand how something like this could happen, we need to go back to a specific time and place. Japan in the 1930s was a nation possessed by the dream of empire. The military had seized control of the government, and in 1931, they invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. They called it Manchukuo, a puppet state where Japanese law meant nothing and Japanese ambition meant everything. The army's leadership believed that the next great war would not be won with bullets alone. They became obsessed with a new kind of weapon, one you could not see, could not hear, and could not stop. Biological weapons. Germs that could wipe out entire cities without destroying a single building. And for this vision, they needed a particular kind of man. They found him in Shudo Ishii, a young physician from Kyoto Imperial University, brilliant, charismatic, and utterly without conscience. Ishii had a gift for convincing people that the impossible was not only possible, it was necessary. By 1936, he had persuaded the army to fund a massive secret facility near the city of Harbin. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. A harmless name, a bureaucratic name, a lie. Inside the complex at Pingfang, over 6 square kilometers of laboratories, prisons, and crematoria, something else was happening. Something the world had never seen before. The men who worked there did not call their subjects prisoners. They did not call them patients. They called them by a single word, maruta. In Japanese, it means logs. The logs arrived by train. They came from every corner of the Japanese Empire. Chinese farmers, Korean laborers, Russian prisoners of war, Mongolian herders, political dissidents, common criminals, and ordinary people swept up off the streets for no reason at all. No one knows exactly how many. At least 3,000 died inside the walls of Unit 731. But that number is only the beginning. What happened to them was not random violence. It was science. Cold, methodical, documented science. The men in white coats kept detailed records. They took photographs. They drew diagrams. They measured everything. And they felt nothing. Vivisection. The word comes from Latin, to cut alive. At Unit 731, it was routine. Surgeons removed the organs of living, conscious prisoners to study the human body in real time. They amputated limbs to watch how long a person could survive without blood. They performed unnecessary surgeries simply to practice techniques. No anesthesia, no mercy, just data. Why? Because an unconscious body does not react the same way as a conscious one. Because the army wanted to know exactly how much trauma a soldier could endure before he died. Because to these men, the logs were not human. They were materials. One former member of the unit later described how the prisoners were kept in good health before their experiments. They were fed nutritious meals. They were given exercise. They were kept alive so that their deaths would be scientifically useful. Then there was the biological warfare program. The unit weaponized the most terrifying diseases known to humanity: bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery. They injected prisoners with these diseases and studied every stage of infection. They tested vaccines by inoculating some prisoners and leaving others unprotected. They developed special ceramic bombs designed to scatter fleas infected with plague over enemy cities. The scale was industrial. According to testimony from the Khabarovsk trials, the unit could produce 300 kilograms of plague bacteria per month and up to a ton of anthrax. One former member later admitted that the total amount of bacteria produced was enough to destroy all of humanity. The frostbite experiments. In the frozen winters of Manchuria, Japanese soldiers were losing limbs to the cold, so Ishii's doctors strapped prisoners to posts outdoors in sub-zero temperatures. They exposed different parts of their bodies to the wind. Then they tested treatments, dipping frozen limbs in water of varying temperatures, leaving some to thaw naturally, observing how long it took for tissue to die. Many of the prisoners died. Others survived but lost their arms, their legs, their fingers. The data was compiled into manuals for the Japanese army. The pressure chamber experiments. Prisoners were placed in altitude chambers designed to simulate high-altitude conditions. The pressure was lowered slowly, or sometimes quickly, while doctors observed what happened. Eyes bulged from sockets, blood vessels burst, organs failed from the inside. The purpose was to understand the limits of the human body for pilots and submariners. The prisoners were expendable. The data was not. But the worst experiments did not happen inside the walls of Pingfang. They happened in Chinese cities and villages. In 1940, Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs on Ningbo. The bombs shattered on impact, releasing clouds of fleas infected with bubonic plague. Within weeks, an epidemic swept through the region. In 1941, the same thing happened in Chengde. In 1942, during the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, Japanese ground forces contaminated wells and food supplies as they retreated, unleashing cholera and typhus on the civilian population. Historians estimate that over 300,000 people died as a direct result of Japan's biological warfare program. Farmers, merchants, children, elderly women drawing water from village wells. They never knew what hit them. They never knew why. And inside Unit 731, the scientists celebrated their success. In August 1945, everything changed. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and swept into Manchuria. As the Red Army approached Harbin, the commanders of Unit 731 had one priority: destroy the evidence. They detonated the buildings at Pingfang. They burned every document they could find, and they killed every remaining prisoner. Hundreds of men and women who had survived the experiments were executed in the final days. Their bodies were cremated or thrown into the Songhua River. Most of the scientists fled back to Japan, but some were captured by Soviet forces. In December 1949, the Soviet Union held a trial in the city of Khabarovsk. 12 members of Unit 731 were prosecuted for preparing and using bacteriological warfare. They confessed. They described the experiments in detail. The proceedings were public. The evidence was overwhelming. But the Western world barely noticed. The Cold War had begun, and the United States had other priorities. American intelligence officers had learned of Unit 731 shortly after the war ended. They interviewed Shiro Ishii and his colleagues, and they realized something that would change everything. These men possessed data that America desperately wanted. The United States had never tested biological weapons on living human subjects. The Japanese had done it for years. They had thousands of pages of documentation, autopsy reports, pathology slides, infection curves, all meticulously recorded, all purchased with human lives. So a deal was made. In exchange for the data, the United States granted immunity to every member of Unit 731. No war crimes trials, no prison sentences, no justice. The agreement was kept secret for decades. Later research revealed that American occupation authorities not only protected these scientists, they made direct cash payments for their experimental results. Shiro Ishii never faced justice. He returned to Japan and lived quietly until 1959, when he died of throat cancer. Cancer of the voice. He took his secrets to the grave, but not before they had been sold to the highest bidder. Other members of Unit 731 went on to have successful careers. Some became professors at prestigious universities. Others led pharmaceutical companies. One became the president of the Japan Medical Association. The men who had vivisected living prisoners became the leaders of Japan's post-war medical establishment. They were honored. They were respected. They were never held accountable. One of them later said, when asked about the experiments, that they had no choice, that it was war, that science requires sacrifice. The victims were never asked what they thought. Today, the site of Unit 731 is a museum. The Exhibition Hall of Evidence of Crimes Committed by Unit 731 in Harbin receives millions of visitors every year. They walk through the remaining buildings, they see the incinerators, they read the documents, they stand in silence before the photographs on the wall. Those photographs show young faces, old faces, children. Their names are mostly unknown. Their stories are mostly unwritten. But they existed. They breathed. They hoped. And they were turned into data, then into ash, then into silence. In Japan, the history remains contested. Textbooks have removed references to Unit 731. Successive governments have refused to fully acknowledge the crimes. Lawsuits filed by Chinese victims have been dismissed. When films and documentaries attempt to tell the story, Japanese authorities sometimes try to block their distribution, calling them anti-Japanese propaganda. And the data? The United States used it. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, American biological warfare researchers studied the Unit 731 reports for decades. Whether the information was actually useful is a question historians still debate. Some argue that the experiments were so cruel, so contaminated by suffering, that the results were worthless. Others suggest that some findings did advance American knowledge. But that debate misses the point. The data was purchased with blood, and the purchase came with a price. The world's first precedent for trading justice for science. The deeper legacy of Unit 731 is a question about what happens when science loses its ethics, when doctors become soldiers, when human beings become logs. The men in Pingfang believed they were serving their country. They believed the ends justified the means. They were wrong, and the world let them be wrong. In the ruins of Pingfang, there is a wall. On that wall, preserved behind glass, are photographs of the victims. Young faces, old faces, children. Their names are mostly unknown, their stories are mostly unwritten. But they existed, they breathed, they hoped, and for decades, the world cooperated in their erasure. Governments made deals, historians looked away. The men in white coats lived out their lives in comfort. But the wall remains. The photographs remain. And as long as they do, a question remains. What do we owe the dead? What do we owe the truth? Thousands of people entered those walls. Not one ever walked out. And for 50 years, the world pretended those walls never existed. If this story should not be forgotten, share this video, subscribe to Time Fragment, and walk with us through the days that changed history.